going on very collaboratively to combine two space-based technologies to study bird migration and bird biology. One is a whole suite, first is a whole suite of new remote sensing technologies that are coming on board using both airborne and space-based implementations to map and study habitat and habitat change so that we can identify very specifically what's going on with the land surface. And the second is a very exciting technology implemented currently on the International Space Station through a partnership with Germany and Russia to actually be able to receive sensor data from animals more or less anywhere in the world between 50 north and 50 south. The orbit of the International Space Station covers that. So animal tracking and habitat monitoring from space. Right now, this is a research and technology development activity coordinated by the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology on the left and the Jet Propulsion Lab on the right, with many international partners. And I'm going to talk about work that reflects a number of different activities. From our NASA point of view, we have a number of science and applications priorities that include conservation, as has been really, I think, very clearly demonstrated, conservation of species that have global ranges and have to be studied across their range, while bringing in remote habitats. In many cases, as you could see from some of the tracking images, birds are going to places that are very hard to visit, very hard to see, areas where there's not a lot of in situ field research on the ground, where most of what we know about land cover and land use change actually comes from remote sensing. We're very concerned with being able to monitor key resource regions, the species that are present and the structure of those ecosystems that affect how migratory birds may use them. As several people have mentioned, animal-borne disease is an increasing concern, both for the health of animal populations and for the health of human populations. And monitoring of both habitat and movement is critical for understanding that. And finally, something that I think has been mentioned, but perhaps not emphasized as much as I would have, migratory species provide really essential ecosystem services. And this is, I think, increasingly becoming obvious with the decline of, for example, pollinating species. But this is really emerging as a much more important subject, and one which this combination of tracking and habitat is really ideal for studying. Now, this is just an image of migration. You've seen many of them like this. But in this case, it's superimposed on the time series of phenology from the MODIS satellite. And the point that I want to make here is that birds are moving to their own calendar, but we're able to observe from space some of the cues to that calendar. In this case, the greening of vegetation, the receding of seasonal snow cover, and if you look at this over longer periods of time, changes to the vegetation that occur through disturbance, for example, changes to fire frequency, and of course, harvesting, land use change, and agriculture. So these new technologies provide new views of global phenomena. And I just want to use this to sort of flag three key resources that we have. First, the International Space Station, which has become more and more important as a laboratory for new technologies for studying the Earth. We can put instruments up there relatively quickly. I'm going to hate myself for saying this, relatively inexpensively, despite the fact that the numbers are still rather breathtaking. They're less breathtaking. And finally, international partnership, and I'm just illustrating this through an image of the GRACE mission, which actually measures things like ocean currents and groundwater storage, but which we're examining as a platform for next generation animal tracking from space. Now, one of the most important technologies that we have for habitat mapping over large areas is LiDAR imaging, which can reconstruct through the 3D structure of a forest. It can tell us about layering in the vertical, but it can also tell us about gaps, edges, and heterogeneity. And we're now implementing that from space with a mission that was launched not long ago called JET, which has nothing to do with Star Wars. It's the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigator, and it's provided extraordinary data. So here, this is just an image that one of my young colleagues put together. On the left is the way in which JEDI over 2 years would sample a forest, in this case in the Sierra Nevada. On the right, you can see the reconstruction of that forest from airborne laser scanning, which provides a complete 3D wall-to-wall view of the forest, with the little red profiles showing the sampling that we'll get over about a 2-year period from space. Now, that doesn't look so great if you're thinking about managing a few hectares. But imagine now having that data globally, everywhere between 50 North and 50 South, many critical habitats. We will now have much more structural information than we've ever had before. Imaging spectroscopy is another new technology that goes beyond the sort of greenness images that we've seen to actually be able to characterize some of the key chemical characteristics of vegetation that define plant species. These are just some images showing on the bottom what the spectra of these different surfaces look like. We can characterize the composition of ecosystems, sometimes down to individual species. We can almost always differentiate between different agricultural crops. In some cases, we can tell the difference between different varieties of crops. We can do the same thing in the coastal ocean and provide tremendous information on habitat for birds that use the coastal zone. And I should mention, I don't have a good image of it here, we can actually image plastic pollution in the water column and on the shore when it's in reasonably high concentrations, as well as providing a lot of geological background. This is a comparison, but this is just for an area in Southern California, showing what our current mapping technology shows, basically mapping this entire area as chaparral. In contrast, on the right, what we can show with spectroscopy and LiDAR fusion is an almost species by species mapping of habitat. And we've used this in a project together with Environment for the Americas to actually look at post-fire succession, where you can see during the first 4 or 5 years after the fire, dominance by invasive grasses that are very deleterious for biodiversity, followed by an epic drought, the epic California drought of the 20-teens, during which actually this system self-restored to natural chaparral habitat, and coordinated avian surveys actually showed the development of the critical habitat, in this case for hummingbirds, who depend on some of the flowering species that again recovered over this decadal period. I should tell you, right as this study concluded, this area burned again. We've also been using a combination of spectroscopy and thermal imaging, in this case to combine information about vegetation on the left, high vegetation, on the right, low vegetation, and temperature to look at microhabitat within urban areas. And we've begun to do avian surveys that are mapped into this thermal environment within Los Angeles to look at how birds are using, this is with collaborators at UCLA, to look at how birds are using this combination of vegetation and heat to sort out where they go. Now I want to talk about Icarus, Martin's part of this talk. Icarus is on the International Space Station. It's a partnership between the Russian Space Agency, Roscosmos, the German Space Agency, and the Max Planck Society. You can see the 2 antennas there. They cover a very wide swath, and they create a very new capability with rather small tags. Right now they're about 5 grams. We think they'll soon be 2 grams, and we have a technology advancement that will bring them to under 1 gram. And they're not just location tags. They do have a GPS receiver, so the bird knows where it is from its relationship to space continuously. The Icarus antenna does not determine the location. In fact, as the space station passes over, the bird basically tweets the space station with a time series of locations and other sensor readouts. And this system is just becoming operational. This is what an Icarus tag looks like. Martin on the left, his colleague on the right. Again, they're currently suitable for relatively big animals, but they provide a tremendous amount of information. And right now, that information can be retrieved about once a month. So with 256 characters, you can store a number of locations or other types of information. Some of these are tagged for altitude so that we can observe vertical behavior of birds. Many of them have temperature sensors. This is a very interesting application. It turns out that when birds are carrying avian flu, this is data collected from a duck on migration, they actually get a fever, and you can identify the birds that are sick while they're actually actively carrying avian flu from their body temperature. The technology is not only amazing and scientifically important, it's really incredibly beautiful. This is video recorded from a tag with a camera on a bird flying over the Alps. And I just want to point out that the information that comes from this is not just data, but it's really an inspiring new view of the majesty of nature. And I feel like I have to say that because we have a reputation for being soulless engineers at NASA. And I just really want to emphasize that we are a bit more than that. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow.